A Navy SEAL returned home after years away, but his German shepherd froze beside his elderly mother as if sensing something terribly wrong. When her sleeve slipped, Eli saw bruises around her wrist, yet Margaret quickly claimed she had simply fallen. Days later, Eli discovered that almost everyone in Alderwick depended on one wealthy, respected man they were too afraid to question. Then Rook reacted near a hidden feed area, and a sick animal hinted that the secret might reach far beyond Eli's mother. As workers began speaking, Eli realized their wages, homes, debts, and silence were all tied to the same powerful farm. What started as a son protecting his mother soon became a fight for an entire town to find the courage to stand together. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like this video and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and hope. The road into Alderwick curved between white-barked birches and long fields of alfalfa, just as Elias Calder remembered it. 13 years had passed since the little northern Minnesota town had been anything more than a place he visited between deployments, yet the landscape seemed stubbornly unwilling to grow old. Alder Lake still caught the afternoon sun like a sheet of blue glass. The white-steepled church remained across from the diner on Main Street. Red maples had only begun to burn orange at their edges, and beyond them, hayfields rolled toward a dark wall of pine. Eli drove with one hand resting loosely on the wheel. At 40, he stood 6 feet 1, about 1.85 meters, with broad shoulders and a solid, regularly trained build that looked less like a bodybuilder's physique than the disciplined strength of a man who had spent his adult life staying ready. His clean-shaven face was distinctly American and masculine, angular through the cheekbones with a strong chin and a straight nose. Dark brown hair, touched prematurely with silver at the temples, was cut in a neat undercut. His deep blue-gray eyes carried a quiet sadness that rarely changed, even when he smiled. He wore the same kind of clothing he preferred whenever he was away from ceremony and attention. A fitted, long-sleeved green camouflage uniform set, clean and sharply kept, with matching trousers and dark combat boots. Everything about him suggested discipline without performance. Beside him sat Rook. The 7-year-old male German shepherd had been Eli's working partner long enough that the word dog often felt inadequate. Rook was large and athletic, his thick coat golden yellow beneath a broad black saddle stretching across his back. His muzzle was dark, his ears stood high, and intelligent amber eyes watched the passing countryside with almost unnerving patience. A small scar near his right ear was the only obvious evidence that his life had not always been this peaceful. Around his neck was a plain, dark brown leather collar with a metal identification tag. Rook rarely barked without cause. More importantly, Rook rarely stopped without one. Eli glanced toward him as they passed the old lake road. Almost home. Rook flicked one ear. Eli smiled faintly. Try to contain your enthusiasm. For most of the drive, Eli had been imagining his mother waiting on the porch of the cream-colored house overlooking Alder Lake. He could almost see Margaret complaining that he had grown thinner when he had not, asking whether he was eating properly, then feeding both him and Rook before either could answer. Instead, Eli slowed in front of the house and felt something inside him go still. The porch was empty. So were the windows. Grass had risen almost to the bottom step. A faded real estate sticker remained on one corner of the front window, and the old mailbox leaned slightly toward the road. Eli killed the engine. Rook looked at him. "No," Eli murmured. He stepped out. The front door was locked. Curtains had been removed. Through the window he could see pale rectangles on the walls where family photographs had once hung. His mother had not simply gone away for a few days. She no longer lived here. A screen door creaked next door. Elias Calder? Eli turned. Mabel Ross stood at the edge of her porch. At 74, Mabel was a small, wiry woman barely over 5 feet 3, with short, snow-white hair curled close around a weathered face and sharp brown eyes that made people feel she remembered every foolish thing they had done since childhood. Her skin was pale and freckled from decades of gardening. She wore a lavender house sweater over a floral blouse and moved with a slight stiffness in one knee, but her voice remained brisk enough to command a room. Mabel had known Eli since he was a boy. She had once caught him stealing blueberries from her garden and forced him to weed 3 rows before letting him keep them. "You got tall," she said. Eli glanced down at himself. "That happened 20 years ago, Mrs. Ross. And you still call me Mrs. Ross, so apparently the Marines didn't ruin everything." SEALs. Military is military when you're 74. Rook walked over and politely smelled her hand. Mabel's expression softened immediately. "Well, you're better mannered." Then she looked toward Margaret's empty house. The humor disappeared. "You didn't know." It was not a question. Eli's jaw tightened. "Know what?" Mabel hesitated. "She sold it last fall." For several seconds the only sound was wind moving through the birches. "She told me the roof needed repairs." "It did." "She told me she was staying with a friend while they were being done." Mabel lowered her eyes. "Your mother has always been very talented at telling the truth in pieces." That hurt more than Eli expected. During the last 18 months, deployments and irregular schedules had reduced his conversations with Margaret to short calls at inconvenient hours. She always said she was fine. She asked about him. She asked about Rook. He had never heard fear in her voice. Or perhaps he had heard it and mistaken it for age. "Where is she?" Mabel nodded north. "Silver Crown Farm. She has one of their little employee cottages now." Eli stared at her. "My mother works for Silver Crown?" "She says it keeps her busy." Mabel's mouth tightened. "And Margaret has always said a lot of things when she doesn't want people worrying." Silver Crown Farm sat 3 miles outside Alderwick, where the lake country opened into broad pasture. If Eli had been expecting neglect, he found the opposite. The property looked almost too perfect. Fresh red paint covered the barns. White fencing divided immaculate green fields. Cattle rested beneath oak trees, while tractors moved slowly in the distance. Flower boxes brightened the administrative building, and maples along the gravel drive had begun turning gold and crimson under the late summer sun. A large wooden sign read, "Silver Crown Farm, Harrow Family, Estone 1989. Eli parked near the main barn. Rook jumped down beside him. They had walked perhaps 50 yards when the German shepherd stopped, not slowed. Stopped. His body became perfectly still. Eli took another step before realizing Rook was no longer beside him. He turned. Rook's ears had lifted toward a low service building behind the main barn. "Rook." The dog did not move. Eli followed his gaze. A woman was pushing a utility cart loaded with folded linens, cleaning supplies, and 2 heavy buckets. Eli recognized the way she leaned into the handle before he recognized her face. "Mom?" Margaret Calder froze. At 69, Margaret remained taller than many women her age, around 5'6", but she was noticeably thinner than Eli remembered. Her chestnut brown hair had faded heavily into silver and was tied in a neat low knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was long and graceful, with soft cheekbones, fair skin lined gently around gray-blue eyes that had once seemed incapable of hiding emotion from her son. Those eyes now revealed surprise first, then joy, then something else Eli could not name before she covered it with a smile. "Eli." She released the cart. For a moment he was 40 years old and 10 years old at exactly the same time. Margaret wrapped both arms around him. "You didn't tell me you were coming today. That was supposed to be the surprise." "Well," she touched his face. "You succeeded." Her eyes shone. Eli hugged her again, more slowly this time. She felt too light. Margaret wore a pale blue flannel shirt beneath a beige-brown cardigan, faded jeans, and clean but worn brown work boots. The clothes suited the woman Eli remembered, practical, modest, unwilling to throw away anything that still had life left in it. The heavy cart did not. "You work here?" "Only a little." Eli looked at the buckets. Margaret followed his gaze. "Don't start. I haven't said anything. You inherited your father's eyebrows. They say plenty." Despite himself, Eli smiled. Margaret explained that she had originally been hired to wash work clothes, tidy offices, prepare simple lunches, and keep several flower beds alive. Silver Crown had been short-handed lately, she said, so everyone helped with whatever needed doing. Her explanation was sensible, almost too sensible. Then Rook approached. Usually he greeted Margaret with the joyful lack of dignity reserved for exactly 3 people in his world. Today he did something different. He walked around her once, slowly. He smelled her left hand, then her right, and sat against her leg. Margaret looked down. "Oh, sweetheart." She bent and wrapped an arm around his neck. Her cardigan sleeve slid backward. 3 dark marks showed along the inside of her wrist. Eli saw them immediately. Margaret saw him see them. She pulled the sleeve down. "Mom, I fell." "When?" "Last week." "Where?" Margaret's eyes moved away for half a second. "The back steps." Eli said nothing. He had spent enough years listening to frightened people explain injuries to know that truth usually came with unnecessary details. Fear preferred short sentences. Rook lowered his head onto Margaret's knee, and Margaret's fingers trembled against his fur. Rehook. Then something stranger happened. A utility vehicle turned the corner of the barn. Its engine was not loud. No one shouted. Nothing threatening occurred. Yet the instant Margaret heard it, her hand tightened sharply in Rook's coat. Rook felt it. The shepherd rose without a command and moved half a step in front of her, not growling, not baring his teeth, simply placing his body between Margaret and the approaching vehicle. Eli watched his mother. She whispered, almost unconsciously, "It's all right." But Eli could not tell whether she was speaking to Rook or to herself. The vehicle stopped nearby. The man who stepped down from it looked nothing like someone Margaret should fear. Silas Harrow was 52, around 6 feet tall, with a fit, well-kept build and the composed posture of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. His face was long and distinguished, with a straight nose, narrow mouth, and intelligent dark eyes. Salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back from his forehead. He was clean-shaven and dressed in an ivory shirt beneath an expensive dark brown ranch jacket, dark denim, and polished leather boots. His smile appeared effortless. "Elias Calder." Silas extended his hand. "I heard one of Alderwick's own finally made it home." Eli shook it. "Eli is fine." Then Silas. His manner was warm without being overfamiliar. He thanked Eli for his military service. He complimented Margaret's work. He asked thoughtful questions about how long Eli would be home without prying into anything operational. Then, without hesitation, he said, "Margaret, take the month off." Margaret blinked. "Silas?" "Paid." He looked at Eli. "She deserves time with her son." There was nothing aggressive in his voice, nothing crude. If anything, Silas seemed generous. That bothered Eli more than hostility would have. Good men could be kind. Bad men could be kind. Kindness alone proved nothing. "That's generous," Eli said. Silas shrugged lightly. "Your mother has earned more than a little generosity." Rook sat beside Margaret. His amber eyes remained fixed on Silas. That evening, Eli followed Margaret to the employee cottage where she now lived. It was small but clean, set among 6 nearly identical houses near the northern edge of Silver Crown property. Margaret made tea. Eli asked about the old house. She told him the taxes, roof, heating, and maintenance had become too much after his father died. "I didn't need all those rooms." "What happened to the money?" Margaret's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Life happened." "Mom." "Eli." There was affection in the answer, and a boundary. For the moment, he respected it. At 3:17 in the morning, Rook rose from the floor. Eli opened his eyes immediately. The shepherd stood beside the front window. An engine moved outside, slowly. A dark Silver Crown pickup rolled along the employee road at barely more than walking speed. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing her cardigan over her nightclothes. She saw the truck. The teacup in her hand trembled against its saucer. Eli watched her face. She did not look surprised. She looked afraid. The pickup continued down the road and disappeared among the trees. Eli asked nothing. Not yet. Margaret returned to her room. Rook followed. The dog lowered himself across the hallway outside her door and placed his head on his paws. Eli remained in the dark kitchen, staring toward the road. His mother had said she fell. Maybe she had. But accidents did not make a woman afraid of headlights passing her window. And Rook did not lie. By dawn, the German shepherd was still outside Margaret's door. Not like a pet waiting for breakfast. like one soldier who had quietly recognized that another living soul no longer felt safe. Eli spent the next 4 days doing something he had learned to value long before he learned how to fight. He listened. He did not ask Margaret again about the parts of her life she had chosen not to explain. He did not confront Silas Harrow, and he did not wander around Silver Crown behaving like a soldier searching enemy territory. Instead, Eli walked Alderwick with Rook. The town was small enough that a person could cross most of it before a second cup of coffee cooled. Main Street descended gently toward Alder Lake, passing a hardware store, a pharmacy, the old white church, and a brick diner whose neon coffee cup had flickered in the front window for as long as Eli could remember. Summer still held the afternoons warm, but mornings had begun carrying the clean edge of northern autumn. Maple leaves gathered red along their veins. Fishing boats moved across the lake before sunrise, leaving silver wakes behind them. Alderwick looked healthy. That was the first thing that troubled Eli. Places with nothing to hide were often messy. Alderwick looked carefully maintained. The school field had new aluminum bleachers. The volunteer fire station displayed a polished rescue truck. Hanging above the entrance to the community center was a plaque thanking the Harrow Family Foundation. At the public boat landing, another plaque carried the same name. At the children's playground, another. Silas Harrow was everywhere without physically being anywhere. Rook trotted beside Eli with his usual steady gait, golden black coat bright beneath the morning sun. He had returned to his normal calm since arriving in town, but Eli noticed how often the shepherd stopped to study people rather than places. Animals, Eli had long believed, were terrible politicians. They did not care who owned the largest farm. They cared who was nervous, who smelled afraid, who moved differently when someone entered a room. That made Rook useful in ways no resume could explain. Eli's first real conversation happened at Finch's diner. Behind the counter stood Carol Finch, 56, a broad-shouldered woman with a warm round face, lightly freckled skin, and auburn hair streaked with gray, twisted into a loose bun that never seemed to survive an entire shift. She wore black slacks, sensible shoes, and a pale yellow diner blouse beneath a striped apron. Carol had the habit of calling everyone honey, regardless of age, and had spent 30 years learning which customers wanted advice, which wanted pie, and which mostly needed somebody to remember their name. She placed coffee in front of Eli without asking. "You still drink it like punishment?" "Black?" "That's what I said." Rook settled beneath the stool. Carol slid a small bowl of water toward him. "Your partner looks smarter than you." "He encourages that rumor." Her laugh came easily. They talked about ordinary things first. The lake, the old high school. People Eli remembered who had moved south. Then he asked how Alderwick had managed to stay so prosperous when so many northern farm towns had struggled. Carol wiped the counter. "Well, if you're looking for the short answer, Silas Harrow." Eli waited. Carol continued. 12 years ago, Northern Valley Dairy shut down. Almost 200 jobs vanished in one announcement. Families started leaving before the month was over. Her cheerful expression softened. "My brother lost his job there, so did my husband." She pointed vaguely toward the street. The hardware store nearly closed. 2 farms went into foreclosure. There were houses you could buy for less than a new truck. Then Silas expanded Silver Crown. He bought struggling farms, added cattle operations, built distribution contracts, and hired dozens of people who otherwise would have left town. According to Carol, he had also paid for repairs at the school, helped modernize the fire department, and covered medical expenses for several local families. "He didn't just write checks," she said. "He kept this town from becoming another exit sign people drove past." There was genuine gratitude in her voice. That mattered. Eli had expected fear to create silence. He had not expected gratitude to help maintain it. "What does Silver Crown provide its workers?" Carol turned to refill another customer's cup. "Housing for some, transportation, loans if they need them." "Loans?" Her hand stopped for less than a second. "Help," she corrected. "What kind?" Carol smiled, but the expression no longer reached her eyes. "You've been home 4 days, and you're already asking accountant questions." "Bad habit." "No, honey, your bad habit used to be climbing Mr. Walker's water tower." "That was once." "It was 3 times. Carol moved away before he could return to the subject. Eli watched her go. She had not refused to answer. She had simply known exactly where to stop. Over the next 2 days, the same pattern repeated. At the feed store, Eli learned Silver Crown employees could purchase work supplies through payroll deductions. At the service station, he noticed a company van dropping off 6 workers who all lived in Silver Crown housing. Near the county market, an older laborer joked that most of his paycheck took the scenic route back to Harrow before it reached the bank. Then the man's smile disappeared when another Silver Crown truck entered the parking lot. Eli did not ask for names. He did not need them yet. The shape of the system was becoming visible. A worker could receive wages from Silver Crown, live in a Silver Crown cottage, use Silver Crown transportation, purchase supplies through company deductions, take a company advance when an unexpected medical bill arrived. If that worker lost the job, the consequences might arrive all at once. Income, housing, transport, debt. No gates were required. Dependence could build its own fences. Rehook. Late on the 3rd afternoon, Eli and Rook passed the small community grocery near the lake when Rook suddenly stopped beside a bench. An elderly farmhand sat there with a folded pay envelope in his hands. The man was not crying. He was staring at a receipt. His thumb moved over the same line again and again. Rook quietly walked toward him. The man looked up, startled, then gave a tired smile and scratched beneath Rook's jaw. "Good dog." Rook leaned against his knee. For several seconds the man's shoulders loosened. Then he noticed Eli. His hand immediately folded the receipt inward. "Beautiful shepherd." "Thank you." The man stood too quickly. A few coins spilled from his pocket onto the pavement. Eli bent automatically to help. "No." The word came sharply. Eli stopped. The man gathered the coins himself, his face flushed with embarrassment. Before leaving, he tucked the pay envelope deep into his coat. Rook watched him disappear around the corner. Eli looked down at the shepherd. Nothing had happened. No accusation, no confession. Yet Eli could not forget the man's instinctive need to hide a simple piece of paper. Sometimes fear announced itself with a scream. Sometimes it folded a receipt. Eli returned to Silver Crown the following morning under a perfectly ordinary excuse. Margaret had left her reading glasses in his pickup. He found her in the administration building and stayed only long enough to deliver them. On the way back to the parking lot, a heavy-set man stepped from beside the equipment shed. Nolan Pike was 46 and built like somebody who had spent more years lifting gates than opening laptops. He stood around 5'11" with a thick chest, powerful forearms and shoulders that had gone slightly heavy with age. His square face had a blunt nose, deep lines beside the mouth and brown-gray eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against either sunlight or disappointment. Dark brown hair, cut short and practical, showed early gray near the ears. He was clean-shaven except for a faint shadow along his jaw by midday. His work shirt was dark denim, sleeves rolled to the forearms, over a gray undershirt. Brown work trousers and worn boots carried the dust of the farm. Nolan had once owned land of his own. Eli remembered hearing the Pike farm had failed years earlier after 2 terrible seasons and a bank foreclosure. Silas had apparently given Nolan work afterward. Some men became softer after losing everything. Nolan appeared to have become harder. "You're Margaret's boy." "Eli." "Nolan Pike." They shook hands. Nolan's grip was firm without turning the gesture into a contest. "Your mother talks about you." Hopefully selectively. A humorless smile touched Nolan's mouth. "She works hard." "So I've noticed." Something in Eli's tone made Nolan study him. "Margaret likes keeping busy." "So she says." Nolan shifted his weight. "She gets curious, too." Eli said nothing. Nolan looked toward the office. "Good woman. But sometimes Margaret doesn't know what's her business and what isn't." There it was. Not a threat. Almost advice. "Does that cause trouble?" Eli asked. "Only if people decide they want it to." Nolan smiled again. This time Eli understood why the expression bothered him. It seemed practiced by a man who had forgotten how to use it for pleasure. Before either said more, a worker called Nolan from the loading area. He walked away. Eli watched him go. Rook had remained beside Eli the entire time. The shepherd never growled, but his eyes followed Nolan until the man disappeared behind the barn. That afternoon, Eli took the long route back toward Margaret's cottage. The road skirted the cattle operation, where several fenced areas spread behind the main barns. Rook moved comfortably ahead. Then his pace changed. He slowed near a squat storage building separated from the larger feed sheds. The building itself was ordinary: corrugated siding, padlocked doors, ventilation panels high along one wall. Rook approached within several yards. His nose lifted. He sampled the air twice. Then he backed away. "Rook?" The German shepherd looked toward Eli, ears forward. He did not appear frightened. He appeared uncertain. That distinction mattered. Eli followed his gaze toward the adjoining pen. Several cattle stood near the water trough. One shifted its weight repeatedly, hind legs seeming briefly unsure beneath it. Another remained lying down while the rest moved toward fresh feed. Eli knew almost nothing about cattle beyond what he had absorbed growing up around farms. So he did the one thing experience had taught him was wiser than pretending expertise. He found someone who knew more. Dr. Rowan Bell's veterinary clinic occupied a converted cedar building near the eastern road out of Alderwick. Rowan was 44, slightly under 5 feet 10, lean rather than athletic, with a narrow, thoughtful face, broad forehead, and gentle brown eyes behind thin rectangular glasses. Sandy brown hair fell neatly across his forehead, beginning to gray at the temples. He wore a light green checked shirt beneath an olive utility vest, brown trousers, and clean work boots. Rowan had the quiet patience common to people accustomed to patients who could not explain where they hurt. When Eli mentioned Silver Crown, that patience became caution. "Cattle lie down," Rowan said. "I assumed. They stumble sometimes." "I assumed that too." Rowan studied him. "What exactly did you see?" Eli described it without interpretation. Rook's reaction, the storage building, the animals, no accusations, no theories. Rowan removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Then he asked one question. "Did you see what was in their feed?" Eli shook his head. "No." Rowan remained quiet. The room suddenly felt smaller. Eli looked toward a metal filing cabinet behind the veterinarian's desk. "You've seen something before." Rowan did not answer immediately. Then he crossed the room, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a thick stack of veterinary records bound with 2 worn rubber bands. He placed them on the desk. Eli looked at the first page, then the second, then the third. Different dates, different animals, different symptoms. But across page after page, the same name appeared: Silver Crown Farm. Dr. Rowan Bell did not touch the stack of veterinary records again after placing them on the desk. He simply let Eli read. The oldest report was dated nearly 2 years earlier. A steer from Silver Crown had been examined after developing sudden fatigue during routine movement between pens. Several weeks later came another case involving mild muscular tremors, then another animal with an irregular heartbeat, then reduced appetite in a group that had previously been healthy. Individually, none of the incidents proved anything. Together, they bothered Rowan. "I've seen cattle get tired," Rowan said. "I've seen nutritional deficiencies, infections, bad feed, heat stress, genetic problems. You practice long enough, almost nothing looks mysterious anymore." Eli turned another page. "Then why keep these together?" Rowan rested both hands against the edge of his desk. "Because I didn't like how often the same name kept showing up. Some animals belonged directly to Silver Crown. Others came from smaller farms that purchased feed through Silver Crown's supply operation." Rowan had recommended further testing more than once, but there was always a complication. An animal was sold. Another was moved to a different facility. A group was reportedly improving before he returned. Nothing illegal in itself. Nothing Rowan could use to accuse anyone. "Could the feed be responsible?" Eli asked. "It could be 50 things." "That's not an answer." "It's the only responsible answer." Eli looked at him. Rowan did not flinch. That earned his respect. The veterinarian continued. "If you're asking whether I think something deserves a closer look, yes. If you're asking whether I can tell you Silver Crown is doing something wrong, no." Eli closed the file. "Fair enough." Rowan hesitated before taking it back. There is one other thing. Eli waited. Don't go trying to prove this yourself. A faint smile touched Eli's mouth. You've been talking to my mother? No. I've met men who are very good at difficult jobs. They usually think competence transfers to every difficult job. That sounds personal. My father once repaired his own septic tank. And? We rebuilt half the yard. For the first time that afternoon, Eli laughed. But the warning stayed with him. The Alderwick Sheriff's Office occupied a modest brick building beside the town hall. Eli arrived shortly after lunch with Rook walking beside him. Sheriff Mara Vance was standing behind the front counter arguing politely with a printer. At 38, Mara was 5'8" with a lean, athletic build and the compact confidence of someone who spent as much time climbing icy roadside embankments as sitting behind a desk. Her chestnut brown hair was tied into a practical low ponytail, revealing a strong, clean jaw and a lightly freckled face, browned slightly by years outdoors. Hazel eyes gave her an alert, evaluating expression even when she smiled. She wore a long-sleeved tan sheriff's shirt, dark brown uniform trousers, duty belt, and polished boots. Eli remembered her at 17, racing him across Alder Lake on borrowed skates and refusing to admit when she had lost. Time had made her calmer. It had not made her easier to fool. She looked up. Well, Mara, you look irritatingly healthy. You still insult people before saying hello. It saves time. Her eyes moved toward Rook. Rook sat. Mara bent slightly. You I missed. Rook offered one paw. Eli stared at him. Traitor. Mara scratched beneath the shepherd's jaw. He remembers quality. The familiarity between them lasted only a moment. Then Mara saw Eli's expression. You didn't come here to discuss my personality. No. She led him into her office. Eli told her what Rowan had shown him. He did not embellish. He described only what he had personally observed and what Rowan had said. Mara listened without interruption. When he finished, she folded her hands on the desk. You have suspicions. Yes. You do not have evidence that Silver Crown committed a crime. I know. Do you? Eli leaned back. Mara. You've been gone a long time, Eli. You know how to gather intelligence. That doesn't make you law enforcement here. I have no intention of breaking into anything. Or following people where you shouldn't? No? Or intimidating someone into talking? He raised an eyebrow. Do you remember who you're talking to? I remember exactly who I'm talking to. That's why I'm saying it. Eli nodded. Understood. Only then did Mara relax. She opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. Over several years, her office had received scattered complaints connected to Silver Crown. Payroll deductions employees did not fully understand. Housing disagreements. Private advances that became difficult to repay. Claims that workers had been threatened with eviction after employment disputes. Nothing formed a clean criminal case. Worse, several complainants later withdrew their statements. One man left town, Mara said. Who? Walter Keene. Walter was around 60 now, a lean former ranch hand with a weather-beaten face, high cheekbones, and graying brown hair that had always looked as if wind had gotten to it before a comb could. Eli remembered him vaguely as a blunt man who repaired fences for half the valley and possessed almost no talent for pretending to like people. He worked at Silver Crown? For years. What happened? He complained about deductions, then later about something involving feed deliveries. Wouldn't give me enough to pursue. A month later, he packed up and went west. Where? I don't know. Mara closed the folder. And that is exactly why you need to be careful. People are afraid of losing more than a paycheck. Eli thought about the old farmhand hiding his receipt. This time he said nothing. That evening, Margaret cooked chicken soup in the small employee cottage. Rain had started over Alderwick, a soft northern drizzle tapping against the windows and darkening the leaves outside. Rook slept near the kitchen table. Eli helped cut bread. Margaret kept a large paper calendar beside the refrigerator. It looked ordinary until Eli noticed several numbers written beside dates in small blue ink. They did not correspond to appointments. Tomorrow's square contained no number yet. What are those? Margaret glanced toward the calendar. Notes. For what? Things I need to remember. Eli looked at her. Margaret kept slicing carrots. He could have pressed. He did not. Then headlights swept briefly across the kitchen wall as a vehicle parked outside one of the neighboring cottages. A door slammed. Margaret flinched. The pen slipped from her fingers and struck the floor. Rook was awake instantly. The shepherd rose and moved between Margaret and the front door. No barking, no aggression, just presence. Eli picked up the pen. He placed it on the table. Then he sat. He did not ask another question. Minutes passed. Rain whispered against the glass. Margaret continued standing at the counter until finally she turned around. Those numbers are feedlots. Eli remained still. Rehook. Margaret reached for the calendar. Her fingers stopped above the number 19. For weeks I thought I was imagining it, she said. Rook slowly crossed the room and rested his chin against her thigh. Margaret looked down at him. I wish people were more like dogs. Eli almost smiled. How so? They notice when something is wrong before deciding whether noticing it will be inconvenient. The words landed harder than Eli expected. Margaret's hand moved over Rook's head. Then she looked at her son, and for the first time since he had returned, she stopped trying to protect him from the truth. Months earlier, while cleaning the administrative office, Margaret had seen an open receiving ledger on a desk. Silver Crown received hundreds of deliveries. She normally paid no attention, but Margaret had spent decades managing household accounts and helping her late husband with farm records. Numbers stayed in her mind. The quantity recorded beside one feedlot did not match the invoice she had carried into the office earlier that morning. She assumed she remembered incorrectly. Then she noticed it again, and again. So she began writing down lot numbers on her kitchen calendar, not because she believed she had uncovered a crime, because she wanted to prove to herself that she was becoming forgetful. Why didn't you photograph the records? Eli asked. Margaret gave him a tired look. Because I'm 69, Eli. I was cleaning an office, not conducting an operation. He lowered his eyes. Right. Besides, I still thought there was an explanation. Then Nolan Pike noticed her looking at the ledger. Margaret had written one number onto a small grocery list. Nolan reached for it. She instinctively held on. He seized her wrist and pulled the paper free. Too hard, his fingers left the bruises Eli had seen. He didn't hit me, Margaret said quickly. That doesn't make it acceptable. I know. What did he say? Margaret took a breath. He said I had a son serving far from home. Eli's expression changed. Margaret saw it. He said, don't turn a small thing into a big thing. Silence filled the kitchen. Eli had experienced anger in many forms. Hot anger was easy. It wanted movement. Cold anger was more dangerous. It wanted precision. He could picture Nolan's hand around his mother's wrist. For one short second, Eli wanted nothing complicated. No investigation, no evidence. Just a door and Nolan standing behind it. Then Rook looked at him. The dog's amber eyes were calm. Eli exhaled. Margaret noticed. Don't. I haven't moved. I know that look. So did Dad. Your father had the same one when the lawnmower broke. That seems disrespectful to my training. Margaret almost laughed. Almost. Eli's voice softened. Why didn't you call me? Her face changed. The question had been waiting between them since he arrived. Margaret lowered herself into a chair. You've spent your adult life going into dangerous places to bring other people out. That's my job. Yes. Her eyes filled, though she refused to let tears fall. And I did not want to become another dangerous place you had to come rescue. Eli looked away. For years he had believed calling home reassured her. He had never considered how carefully she might have constructed those calls to reassure him. Come with me, he said. Tomorrow. We'll leave Alderwick for a while. Margaret shook her head. No. Mom. There are people here who can't leave. She began naming them. Luis Ortega, 57, a broad, gentle Mexican-American ranch worker with silver beginning in his black hair, who was raising his 12-year-old granddaughter after his daughter died in a highway accident. Edith Crane, 63, a thin widow with cropped gray hair and a stubborn sense of dignity, who lived in a Silver Crown cottage and had nowhere else affordable to go. June Merritt, 27, a quiet payroll clerk with shoulder-length dark blonde hair and pale blue eyes, whose father also depended on Silver Crown wages. Then Margaret mentioned Walter Keene. He tried to say something once. Eli looked up. You knew Walter? Everyone knew Walter. What did he say? Not enough. Then he left. Margaret folded her hands. If I leave because you're here to take me away, what happens to everyone whose son doesn't come home wearing combat boots? Eli had no answer. For most of his life, protecting someone meant placing himself between them and danger. Margaret was asking for something harder. Not rescue. Respect. Eli looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. All right. Margaret's shoulders eased. I won't drag you out. Thank you. But I'm not ignoring this. I didn't ask you to. Rook moved into the space between their chairs and lay down. Margaret rested one hand on his golden black head. Eli placed his forearms on his knees. Outside, the rain continued across Alderwick. For the first time since his return, nothing between mother and son had actually become safer. The farm was still there. Nolan was still there. The unanswered questions were larger than before. But something important had changed. Fear had been spoken aloud, and once fear had a name, it no longer owned the whole room. 3 mornings later, Eli stood beside the public boat launch with Mara Vance and Dr. Rowan Bell, while fog lifted slowly from Alder Lake. They were not there because the lake mattered. They were there because none of them wanted the conversation held inside Silver Crown, the sheriff's office, or Rowan's clinic. The rules were simple. No trespassing. No taking records that did not belong to them. No hidden devices. No pretending suspicion was proof. If a worker chose to speak, Mara could document it. If Rowan was lawfully called to examine an animal, he could collect samples necessary for veterinary diagnosis. Eli could observe what any member of the public could lawfully observe. Nothing more. Eli understood why both of them looked at him when Mara finished. I said I understand. Mara folded her arms. You also said that when we were 17 and I told you not to jump off Miller's quarry. That was unrelated. You jumped. The water was deeper than expected. Rowan looked between them. I suddenly understand why your mother worries. Rook sat beside Eli, amber eyes moving from one human to the next as though disappointed by the quality of military planning. Eli scratched behind the shepherd's ear. Apparently I'm outnumbered. The agreement changed the way Eli spent his days. He stopped thinking in terms of secrets and began thinking in terms of patterns. Which Silver Crown trucks entered the public feed road in the morning? Which pens received deliveries later that day? Which workers seemed permanently assigned near Nolan Pike? Which cattle were separated from the larger herd? He kept no dramatic surveillance board, just a small notebook in the pocket of his camouflage trousers. Dates, times, things seen from places where he had every right to stand. Most observations meant nothing. That was important too. A good pattern required knowing what normal looked like. Margaret helped without behaving like an investigator. She did what she had always done. She worked. She carried lunch to people who forgot to stop. She remembered who took coffee with sugar and who secretly fed crusts to the barn cats. She knew which men were too proud to admit their backs hurt and which women worked through headaches because missing a shift meant losing money. One bright afternoon, Margaret asked Eli to help carry 2 insulated food containers toward the eastern cattle barn. Rook came with them. The sky was impossibly blue, and a clean north wind moved through tall grass along the fence. Somewhere beyond the barns, a tractor engine hummed steadily. Nothing about the afternoon suggested danger. They entered the covered passage beside the auxiliary feeding area. Rook stopped. Eli noticed immediately. The shepherd's head lowered toward a torn feed sack lying beside a wooden pallet. A small amount of pale meal had spilled through the damaged seam. Rook approached cautiously. His nose worked once, twice. Then he pulled his head back and took 2 steps away. Margaret frowned. He eats things I've dropped that I wouldn't feed a raccoon. That's an exaggeration. Rook looked at him. Eli reconsidered. Mostly. He did not allow Rook near the spill again. Instead, Eli looked through the open rail toward the adjoining pen. One steer had separated itself from the others. It stood with its head lower than normal. Another animal near the trough shifted unsteadily, regained balance, then remained still. Eli did not touch the feed. He did not collect it. He asked Margaret, who was responsible for the cattle in that section. The animals belonged to a small contract herd temporarily boarded at Silver Crown for Graham Tully, a local farmer recovering from hip surgery. Margaret called Graham. Graham, in turn, asked Rowan to examine the animal. That chain mattered. Rowan arrived 40 minutes later with his veterinary bag. He examined the steer, listened to its heart, checked temperature and hydration, then inspected the feed being provided. Only after receiving Graham's permission did Rowan collect appropriate samples for diagnostic testing. Eli remained several yards away. "What do you think?" he asked. Rowan sealed the sample container. "I think an animal is unwell." "That's it?" "For now." Eli nodded. Rowan looked toward the torn bag. "But now we have something we didn't have before." "What?" "Something we can actually test." Later that evening, Margaret brought Eli to a narrow office attached to the payroll building. June Merritt was waiting inside. She was 27, slender and slightly below average height, with shoulder-length dark blonde hair tucked neatly behind one ear and pale blue eyes that seemed to check the door each time footsteps passed outside. Her oval face would have looked younger if not for the tension around her mouth. She wore a cream knit sweater beneath a soft gray cardigan, dark trousers, and plain ankle boots. June had the careful manner of someone who had spent years learning that saying less could be safer than saying the wrong thing. "This is my son," Margaret said. June gave her a look. "I know who he is." Eli sat opposite her. "I don't need you to tell me anything you don't want to tell me." June almost laughed. "That sounds like something people say right before asking questions." "Then I won't ask one." He waited. Silence did the work. Eventually June said, "People think Silver Crown pays well." Eli remained quiet. "On paper, sometimes it does." She explained that a worker might earn a respectable gross wage, but deductions could remove far more than expected. Housing, utilities, transportation, tools, repayment on advances, occasionally a vague line marked service charge. "What service?" Eli asked. June shook her head. "That's the problem." "Do you know?" "No." That answer came quickly, too quickly. Eli noticed but did not challenge it. June folded her hands. "My father still works here." Thomas Merritt was 61, she explained, a tall, narrow-shouldered maintenance mechanic with thinning gray-brown hair, sun-damaged skin, and permanently grease-darkened fingertips. He had spent most of his adult life fixing engines and irrigation pumps. After June's mother died from cancer 6 years earlier, Thomas had become quieter and more dependent on routine. Silver Crown was not just his job, it was the place that had paid his wages during the worst year of his life. "If I lose this job," June said, "he could lose his too." Eli leaned back. "You don't owe me evidence." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I thought that's why you came." "No." "Then why?" "Because my mother trusts you." June looked toward Margaret. Eli continued, "No one gets to ask you to destroy your life just to prove they're right." For the first time since he entered, June's shoulders lowered. Not completely, but enough. She did not hand him records. She did not confess to a conspiracy. She only said, quietly, "Some deductions don't make sense." It was not evidence, but it was trust beginning. Rehook. As Eli and Margaret left the office, June called after them. "Mr. Calder?" Eli turned. June held nothing in her hands, no paperwork, no file. She simply asked, "Does your dog ever decide someone is safe before you do?" Eli glanced at Rook. "Sometimes." June looked through the glass partition toward the hallway. Thomas Merritt had just entered the building to replace a faulty fluorescent fixture. He moved with a slight stiffness in his left knee, toolbox in one hand, unaware of their conversation. Rook walked over. Thomas stopped. The old mechanic looked uncertain, then slowly lowered his free hand. Rook sniffed it. After a moment, the shepherd leaned his shoulder gently against Thomas's leg. Thomas's weathered face changed, just slightly. He scratched Rook behind one ear. "My wife had one like you," he murmured. "Long time ago." June watched from behind the glass. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the emotion away. Eli understood then that her fear was not primarily for herself. It had a face. It was carrying a toolbox down the hallway. And sometimes courage did not arrive because a person stopped being afraid. Sometimes it arrived because someone finally understood exactly what they were afraid of losing. 2 days passed without news from Rowan. During that time, Margaret and Rook developed a quiet routine of their own. Rook followed her into the barn whenever Eli was nearby, usually settling where he could see both doors. One afternoon, Margaret was stacking clean towels when a metal tray slipped from a shelf across the aisle. It struck the concrete floor with a violent clang. Rook jerked upright. For half a second his body changed completely, muscles rigid, breathing shallow, eyes fixed on nothing visible in the barn. Eli recognized the reaction. Margaret did too, though she did not know its history. She took one step toward Rook, then stopped. Instead of reaching for him, Margaret lowered herself slowly onto an overturned wooden crate several feet away. She said nothing. She waited. Rook remained where he was. A full minute passed, then another. Gradually his ears relaxed. He looked toward Margaret. She held out no hand, made no command. Rook crossed the space himself. He placed his large head on her knee. Only then did Margaret touch him. Her fingers moved gently through the gold fur below his ear. Eli watched from the doorway. Something tightened in his chest. Perhaps Rook had noticed Margaret's fear so quickly because fear was not entirely foreign to him. People often imagined courage as the absence of fear. Eli knew better. Sometimes courage was simply learning that the sound behind you belonged to the present instead of the past. Margaret bent her forehead briefly toward Rook's head. Neither needed to explain anything. Rowan called just before sunset the following day. Eli answered from the porch. "I have preliminary laboratory results." His tone held no triumph. That told Eli enough. What did they find? A compound associated with livestock weight gain. Eli looked toward the fields. Legal? The compound itself has regulated uses in some contexts. What matters is the concentration and the way it appears to have been used in this feed. So the preliminary result doesn't match what should be present under the feeding program documented for that herd. Eli was careful. Does that prove Silver Crown deliberately did something? No, Rowan answered immediately. It proves the sample deserves regulatory review. That distinction mattered. Rowan had already contacted the appropriate state agricultural authority and submitted the laboratory findings through professional channels. From that point onward, the matter no longer belonged only to a veterinarian with suspicions or a Navy SEAL asking questions. It had entered a process. Margaret came onto the porch. Rook followed her. Eli ended the call and looked toward the distant roofs of Silver Crown glowing red beneath the sunset. For weeks, every answer had created another question. Now one question had finally become unavoidable. Not whether something unusual had happened, but something harder. Who knew, and how long had they known? The first rumor reached Alderwick before any official notice did. No one could say exactly where it started. Someone had seen a state vehicle near Dr. Rowan Bell's clinic. Someone else had heard that a feed sample had been sent outside the county. By the end of the week, the story had grown enough that people were discussing Silver Crown in the grocery aisles, then lowering their voices whenever the door opened. Silas Harrow responded in the most effective way possible. He behaved as though nothing was wrong. On Saturday morning, he stood near the town square shaking hands beneath a banner for the upcoming Alderwick Harvest Day. He announced another donation to the volunteer fire department and promised to cover the cost of new uniforms for the middle school baseball team. He smiled for photographs. He asked old farmers about their knees. He remembered the names of grandchildren. When someone casually mentioned rumors about a state review, Silas merely smiled. Silver Crown has always cooperated with regulators. Good farms have nothing to fear from good oversight. It was a perfect answer. No anger, no defensiveness, no threat. Eli watched from across the street with Rook beside him. That was what made Silas dangerous. He did not ask the town to choose between him and the truth. He made people feel that questioning him meant questioning the hospital bill he had once paid, the fire truck he had helped buy, or the job that had kept someone's family in Alderwick. Gratitude had become insulation. and Silas wore it well. That evening Margaret stood at her kitchen sink long after the dishes were clean. Eli sat at the table. Rook slept beneath the window, one ear moving whenever a car passed outside. Margaret had been quiet through dinner. Finally she said, "I knew more than I admitted." Eli did not interrupt. She kept looking through the window. Not everything, not the feed, not what it was, but enough to know something wasn't right. She remembered workers comparing paychecks and then suddenly changing the subject. A man who complained about deductions had been transferred to harder work farther from town. More than once, Rowan had scheduled follow-up visits for animals only to discover they had already been moved. Margaret had noticed. She had simply found reasons not to connect the pieces. "At least people still had jobs," she said. The sentence came out softly, almost like something she had repeated to herself many times. Eli leaned forward. Margaret turned. "I told myself that for years." "Because you were afraid?" "Partly." Her face tightened. "And partly because it was convenient." That admission cost her more. "If I admitted the system was wrong, then I had to admit I was helping it stay quiet." Eli could have told her she was not responsible. He did not. Some forgiveness, he knew, became insulting when offered too quickly. Instead he said, "Then today you can do something different." Margaret looked at him. Nothing dramatic passed between them, just a decision. The first person Margaret invited to dinner was Luis Ortega. At 57, Luis was a broad, heavy-handed man with a strong chest, softened slightly by age, warm brown skin, and thick black hair threaded with silver over the ears. A neatly trimmed gray-black mustache framed a face shaped by long days outdoors, deep lines around dark eyes, sun-darkened cheeks, and a nose that had once been broken and healed slightly crooked. Luis was gentle by nature. He apologized when chairs scraped. He thanked Margaret 3 times for stew. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding arguments because after his daughter died in a highway accident 4 years earlier, his 12-year-old granddaughter Sophia became the center of every decision he made. "I cannot gamble with her roof," he said. His Silver Crown pay looked respectable before deductions. Then came rent, transportation, a loan advance used for funeral expenses, interest, equipment charges. Luis had worked additional shifts for nearly 3 years. His debt had barely changed. "I thought I was bad with money," he admitted. Margaret's expression fell. "So I stopped asking questions." Eli saw the pattern again. The system worked best when each person believed the problem was personal failure. 3 nights later, Edith Crane came. At 63, Edith was tall and exceptionally thin, with straight posture, pale skin, and cropped steel-gray hair that made her narrow face seem even sharper. Her blue eyes were direct, and unlike Luis, Edith did not apologize for occupying space. Widowhood had made her practical rather than fragile. After her husband died from a heart attack 8 years earlier, she had learned to repair leaking faucets, negotiate bills, and tell men twice her size when they were wasting her time. "I don't scare easy," she said. Then she stared into her coffee. "But I do calculate." Edith lived in a Silver Crown cottage. If she lost her job, she believed she would have 30 days to leave. Her retirement savings were small. The nearest affordable apartment she knew of was nearly an hour away. "That is not fear," she said. "It is arithmetic." Margaret nodded. Perhaps that was worse. Soon the kitchen changed. Not physically. It remained the same small room with pale cabinets, a scarred wooden table and curtains Margaret had sewn years earlier, but every few evenings another chair appeared. Then another. A young married couple came next. Ben and Rachel Holloway, both 31, worked seasonal jobs connected to Silver Crown. Ben was tall and narrow with sandy hair, a short clean beard, and an anxious habit of rubbing his palms against his jeans. Rachel was shorter, with dark curly hair, olive-toned skin, and quick green eyes. She spoke more carefully than Ben, but listened with greater intensity. They had a 2-year-old son and had taken a Silver Crown advance after the child needed emergency surgery. Neither believed the debt was being calculated correctly. Until sitting beside Luis, neither had known anyone else felt the same. That realization changed the room. Re-hook. Halfway through the evening, Rook stood up. No sound had startled him. No stranger had arrived. He walked slowly around the table, stopping first beside Louise, then Edith, then Rachel. Finally, he settled in the center of the room. 6 people sat around him. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Margaret looked down at the shepherd. Then she said, "Look at us." Eli followed her gaze. "What?" "We all thought we were alone." Louise gave a tired laugh. "So did I." Edith stared across the table. "That may have been the point." The words changed the atmosphere instantly, not because they proved anything, because everyone understood them. A system did not need to silence an entire town at once. It only needed each frightened person to believe no one else was frightened. Rook rested his head on his paws, and the conversation began again, louder this time. June Merritt arrived nearly a week later. She waited until after dark. Thomas did not come. June carried a thin manila folder against her chest. "I am not stealing company records," she said before sitting down. Mara Vance, who had joined them that evening, answered immediately. "Good. I don't want stolen records." June opened the folder. Inside were copies of her own pay statements, documents she was legally entitled to retain, along with handwritten notes she had made over several months while trying to understand certain deductions. There was no secret database, no dramatic ledger marked fraud, only small inconsistencies, service charges that changed without explanation, repayment amounts that did not match what June expected, different employees receiving differently labeled deductions for what appeared to be the same category. By themselves, they proved little. Placed beside Louise's statements, Edith's rental paperwork, and the Holloway's loan documents, they formed something more useful, a pattern. Mara began arranging official interviews separately. She made one rule clear: no group should rehearse a story. Each person would describe only what happened to them. Facts first. Interpretation later. At roughly the same time, Rowan formally forwarded his veterinary findings through the proper state channels. Several days later, Special Investigator Claire Holloway arrived from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Claire was 41, around 5'7", with a compact athletic frame, medium brown skin, and straight black hair cut just above her shoulders. Her dark eyes were steady rather than severe, and a faint line between her brows suggested years spent reading documents nobody else wanted to read. She wore a navy field jacket over a pale blue shirt, charcoal trousers, and weather-resistant boots. Claire had spent 14 years working regulatory cases involving livestock operations and agricultural business records. She was careful with language. She never called an irregularity fraud before proving it. She never called a violation intentional before establishing who knew what. Eli respected her almost immediately. Claire's first instruction was simple. Do not give me conclusions. Give me records, dates, and first-hand statements. That was exactly what Alderwick was beginning to provide. Walter Keene was harder. Mara eventually found him through his older sister in Montana. Eli spoke to Walter by phone from Margaret's kitchen. Walter's voice was rougher than Eli remembered. So now people care? They're starting to. That's not the same thing. No. The honesty seemed to surprise him. Walter admitted that before leaving Alderwick, he had photographed several feed shipments because quantities recorded at delivery did not match what later appeared in internal receiving notes. He had also kept copies of a few delivery documents that had been given to him as part of his job. Why didn't you give them to Mara? I tried talking first. His voice hardened. Then my hours changed. My rent changed. People stopped sitting next to me at breakfast. Walter paused. You ever watch a whole town decide your trouble because being your friend might cost them something? Eli looked around Margaret's kitchen. Yes, he said quietly. I'm starting to understand. Walter refused to return immediately. But when Eli told him Margaret Calder had spoken, then Louise, Edith, June, and others, the silence on the line changed. Margaret? Yes. Walter exhaled. That woman used to bring pie to every funeral in Alderwick. She still probably would. Another long pause. I'll send what I have directly to the investigator. And an interview? I'll do one. It was enough. At Silver Crown, Nolan Pike felt the ground changing before anyone said it aloud. Silas summoned him to the main office one late afternoon. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching dust above an immaculate oak desk. Silas stood facing the pasture. "State people may ask questions." Nolan folded his arms. "I know. If they ask about barn operations, answer truthfully." Nolan looked at him. "What does that mean?" Silas finally turned. "You manage the barns." A cold weight settled behind Nolan's ribs. "And? What happens there is your responsibility." The words were calm, almost administrative. That made them worse. Nolan remembered the year his farm failed. Silas had offered him work when everyone else saw a man who had lost everything. For years, Nolan had called that loyalty. Standing in the office now, he understood something different. Silas had never rescued him. He had acquired him. Nolan walked out without answering. In the maintenance shed, he stopped beneath a hanging work light. His hands were stained with black grease from repairing a conveyor motor. He stared at them. Strong hands. Useful hands. Hands that had built fences and repaired tractors. Hands that had once held his own daughter when she was small. And hands that had closed too tightly around Margaret Calder's wrist because he had been afraid of disappointing another man. For the first time, Nolan did not ask himself whether Silas had gone too far. He asked a harder question. When had he? And why had it taken him so long to notice? Alderwick harvest day arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost unfair. Blue stretched from one horizon to the other. Maple trees along Main Street had turned copper and scarlet, and strings of small triangular flags fluttered between lampposts. Pumpkins were stacked in pyramids beside hay bales. Children carried paper cups of cider. Country music drifted from a temporary stage near the town square, while smoke from grilled corn and sausages mixed with the sweeter smell of cinnamon. For generations, Harvest Day had been Alderwick's way of insisting that another year had been worth surviving. This year, that insistence carried a different weight. Silver crown banners hung from several booths. The farm remained the festival's largest sponsor. Silas Harrow's name appeared beneath the stage schedule, beside the fire department raffle, and across the sign announcing the children's pumpkin contest. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been canceled. To most visitors, Alderwick looked exactly as it always had. Margaret Calder stood behind a long folding table near the church lawn, slicing blueberry pie. Her pale blue flannel shirt showed beneath the familiar beige-brown cardigan she wore almost every day. Her silver-threaded chestnut hair was tied low at the back of her neck. She still looked thinner than Eli wished, but something in her posture had changed. She no longer seemed to be trying to take up less space. Rook lay beneath the table. The 7-year-old German shepherd rested with his forelegs stretched before him, golden yellow coat bright in the autumn sun, and broad black saddle gleaming across his back. His ears moved constantly, following children, boots, music, and the occasional dropped piece of pie crust. Margaret glanced down. "You're not getting any." Rook looked up. "That expression won't work." Eli stood beside her in his fitted long-sleeved green camouflage uniform set, matching trousers and dark combat boots. At 40, his broad shoulders and disciplined build made him easy to spot in the crowd, but he seemed determined not to become the center of anything. Rook continued staring at Margaret. She sighed. "A very small piece." Eli shook his head. "You lasted 12 seconds. I'm a grandmother. We are constitutionally weak against hungry faces. He's a German shepherd. He has a face." For a few seconds the morning felt ordinary. Eli treasured that more than he expected. Several miles away, the day was becoming less ordinary. Claire Holloway arrived at Silver Crown shortly after 10 with 2 additional state agricultural officers. Sheriff Mara Vance accompanied them, not as the person controlling the investigation, but because Silver Crown sat within her county and employees might need a familiar local officer present. The state team carried signed administrative inspection authority and related legal paperwork, authorizing access to specified feed storage areas and business records relevant to the regulatory inquiry. They did not arrive with sirens. They did not block the road. Workers were not ordered to the ground. Claire's approach was methodical. Storage areas connected to the suspect feedlots were identified. Inventory records were requested. Additional samples were collected through formal procedure. Certain lots were temporarily isolated from use pending review. A small number of operations connected directly to those materials were paused. The rest of Silver Crown continued functioning. That was important. Real investigations rarely looked like the moment in movies when everything stopped at once. Sometimes a system began to unravel while tractors were still running. Silas Harrow arrived at harvest day before noon. He wore the same polished calm that had carried him through weeks of rumor. His ivory shirt was crisp beneath a dark brown ranch jacket. Salt and pepper hair sat neatly in place despite the breeze. At 52, Silas still moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to rooms opening for him before he reached the door. He shook hands. He bought cider from a school fundraiser. He congratulated a 9-year-old girl whose pumpkin had somehow been painted to resemble a cow. If the state inspection concerned him, he did not show it. Then he saw Eli. Silas crossed the grass. Rook raised his head but remained beneath Margaret's table. Elias. Silas. Silas looked around at the festival. You know, when you were a boy, half these storefronts were empty by winter. Eli said nothing. 12 years ago, they nearly became empty again. I know. Silas seemed mildly surprised by the answer. I kept people here. You did. The admission mattered. Silas's jaw loosened slightly. Then maybe you understand why I find all this difficult to appreciate. All what? You came home after years away. Within weeks, people who've known me half their lives are suddenly treating Silver Crown like some kind of enemy. Eli looked toward the school field. Children were running between rows of carved pumpkins. I don't think they needed me to tell them what happened to them. Silas's expression cooled. You think you understand this town? No. That answer stopped him. Eli continued. You understand it better than I do. Silas folded his arms. Then perhaps leave its future to people who stayed. Eli met his eyes. You did help save Alderwick once. Silas remained silent. But saving a place once doesn't mean you own it forever. The smile disappeared, not dramatically, just enough. Silas turned toward Margaret. Perhaps he expected her to look away. She did not. Margaret, he said, I'm disappointed. Her knife paused over the pie. In me? In what this has become? He lowered his voice. When you needed work, Silver Crown gave you work. Margaret slowly placed the knife down. People nearby began to notice. Not enough to form a crowd, enough to become quiet. You did, she said. Silas nodded. And housing. Yes. I treated you fairly. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped around the table. Rook stood. Eli did not move with her. That mattered too. This was not his moment to occupy. Margaret faced Silas alone. You gave me a job, she said, and I gave you my time. Silas opened his mouth. Margaret continued. My mornings, my hands, my back, my years. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway. That exchange was settled every week I worked. Silas's face hardened. You know this town would have suffered without Silver Crown. I know. Margaret's eyes remained steady. That does not mean people should be afraid to ask where their wages went. Nearby, Luis Ortega stopped beside a cider stand. Edith Crane turned from a craft booth. June Merritt, standing near the church steps with Thomas, became perfectly still. Margaret continued. It does not mean people should worry that disagreeing with their employer will cost them the house they sleep in. Silas's expression became colder. And it does not mean warning someone to stay quiet becomes acceptable simply because the warning is polite. Rehook. For one strange second, no one moved. Then a little boy chasing a red paper windmill ran between Margaret and the growing line of onlookers. He stumbled. The windmill fell. Rook stepped forward, picked it gently from the grass, and held it by the wooden stick. The boy stared. Rook carried it back. A few adults laughed softly. The tension cracked just enough for everyone to breathe. The boy took the windmill. Thank you, dog. Rook sat beside Margaret again. She placed one hand against his neck. Eli watched the simple gesture. For weeks, fear had entered rooms before people did. Now, in the middle of the most public day Alderwick had, Rook had done something almost absurdly ordinary. returned a child's toy. And somehow the ordinary moment made what happened next feel even more important. This was not a battlefield. These were neighbors, which meant courage here had to look different. Luis crossed the grass first. He stood several feet behind Margaret. No speech, no accusation, just presence. Edith joined him. Then June. Thomas came beside his daughter, grease still dark beneath the nails of one hand, despite having dressed carefully for the festival. Ben and Rachel Holloway appeared near the rear. Several other Silver Crown workers followed. Nobody shouted. Nobody insulted Silas. They simply stayed. Silas looked at them. For perhaps the first time in years, the people in front of him were not isolated from one another. That changed the balance more effectively than anger could have. Then Nolan Pike arrived. He had come from Silver Crown directly, still wearing his dark denim work shirt and brown work trousers. Dust covered his boots. His square face looked exhausted, and the gray near his temples seemed more noticeable than it had days earlier. Silas saw him. Good. Nolan stopped. Silas spoke carefully. I assume you've explained to the inspectors that barn operations fall under your management. The sentence sounded administrative. Eli understood exactly what it meant. So did Nolan. A silence opened around them. Nolan looked toward Margaret. She did not soften. She did not rescue him from the consequences of what he had done. Then he looked toward Luis, June, Thomas. Finally, Silas. You want me to say it was mine? Silas's eyes narrowed. I want you to answer questions accurately. I did what you told me to do. Nolan? No. The single word surprised even Nolan. He breathed once, then again. I'm done. Silas stared at him. Nolan turned toward Mara, who had just approached from the edge of the square after receiving an update from Claire. I need to give a statement. Mara did not react emotionally. Then we'll arrange that properly. Nolan looked at Margaret. I threatened you. Margaret said nothing. I grabbed your wrist because I was scared you'd write down something I'd have to explain. His voice roughened. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Good, Margaret said quietly. Nolan nodded. That answer hurt. It was supposed to. He turned back to Mara. I'll tell them what I was instructed to do, and what I did myself. By late afternoon, the state inspection at Silver Crown had expanded within the authority already granted. Relevant feedlots were isolated. Additional samples were documented. Specified records were secured for review. Employees were scheduled for interviews. A limited portion of operations connected to the questioned materials remained suspended. Silver Crown did not collapse. Silas was not arrested in front of the festival. No crowd cheered as handcuffs appeared. There were no handcuffs. There was only process. Slow, careful, difficult to reverse once enough people had decided to tell the truth. Silas left Harvest Day before sunset. As he crossed toward his truck, he looked back at Eli. For an instant, the two men held each other's gaze. Eli did not smile. He had not defeated Silas. That was never what had happened. Behind Eli stood Margaret, Luis, Edith, June, Thomas, and workers who had spent years believing their fear belonged only to them. That was what Silas was actually looking at. A community that had discovered its own reflection. Rook turned away from him. The shepherd walked to Margaret. He sat beside her leg. Margaret lowered one hand onto the thick fur at his neck, the same hand that once trembled over a teacup, the same wrist she once hid beneath a sleeve. Now it rested in full view beneath the warm September sun. Steady. And this time, when Silver Crown's trucks passed somewhere beyond the festival grounds, Margaret did not look toward the road. Winter came early to Alderwick that year. By December, snow rested along the shoulders of county roads. Alder Lake had begun freezing near the reeds, and the bright red barns of Silver Crown stood against the white fields like pieces of an older world trying to decide what they would become. The investigation did not end with Harvest Day. In some ways, that afternoon had only begun it. Over the following months, state investigators compared payroll records with employee statements, rental agreements, repayment schedules, veterinary findings, shipping documents, and the materials Walter Keene had preserved before leaving Minnesota. No single page proved everything. That became one of the most important truths of the case. The story existed in accumulation, a deduction here, a changed figure there, a shipment recorded one way at delivery and another way later, a worker transferred after complaining, a feedlot whose documented program did not match what laboratory testing found, a manager who finally admitted which instructions he had followed and which choices had been his own. The pieces did not become dramatic when laid beside one another. They became difficult to deny. Silas Harrow was eventually charged in connection with financial misconduct, regulatory violations related to Silver Crown's livestock operations, and actions intended to pressure employees who questioned company practices. The legal process moved slowly. There were hearings, attorneys, motions, arguments about responsibility. Alderwick learned that justice rarely arrived with the satisfying sound of a door slamming shut. Mostly it arrived in envelopes, certified mail, court dates, documents requiring signatures. Eli found that strangely comforting. A system built quietly over years deserved to be dismantled carefully enough that it could not simply be built again. Nolan Pike cooperated with investigators. Cooperation did not erase what he had done. One cold morning, Nolan came to Margaret's cottage before she moved out. He stood on the porch in his dark denim work shirt beneath a heavy canvas coat, his square face tired and unshaven enough to reveal several days of gray stubble. Margaret opened the door but did not invite him inside. Nolan understood. "I gave them everything I know," he said. "I heard. They said it may matter. It probably will." He stared toward the snow along the walkway. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Margaret considered him. Then she said, "Doing the right thing today doesn't erase what you did yesterday." Nolan nodded slowly. "But," she continued, "it is still worth doing." He looked up. There was no absolution in her face, only fairness. For Nolan, that seemed harder to receive. "Thank you," he said. Margaret closed the door gently after he left. She did not watch him walk away. Silver Crown began losing contracts before the case was resolved. Some buyers suspended purchases. Others demanded independent compliance reviews. Credit tightened. Partners that had once trusted the Harrow name began worrying about what else might emerge. Yet Silver Crown did not simply disappear. Too many families depended on the land. Too many animals needed care. Too much of Alderwick's economy had been built around those barns. Closing everything would have punished many of the same people the investigation was meant to protect. So the transition became complicated, painfully complicated. There were months of negotiations, settlements, and financial restructuring. Part of the property was sold. Some acreage went to neighboring farms. The main livestock facilities attracted a group of local producers and community investors who proposed purchasing the operation through a cooperative structure. Nothing was given away. Workers did not wake up one morning owning a farm because justice had magically rearranged the paperwork. Loans had to be approved. Investors had to be convinced. Budgets had to work. Some plans failed before one finally held together. By spring, the sign at the front entrance changed. The polished crown emblem disappeared. In its place stood a simpler wooden board, Alderwick Farm Cooperative. Luis Ortega became supervisor of the cattle barns. The responsibility frightened him more than he admitted. On his first morning, he walked the entire facility before sunrise and personally checked the feed storage twice. When Eli teased him about becoming management, Luis shook his head. "I have spent too many years complaining about supervisors. God has a sense of humor." June Merritt took charge of the cooperative's payroll system. She insisted every deduction be labeled in plain language and every employee receive a written explanation before signing anything. Thomas Merritt complained that she used too much paper. June told him that was rich coming from a man who saved bolts in coffee cans because they might become useful in 2047. Thomas did not deny it. Edith Crane began helping with bookkeeping several afternoons each week. She claimed she only agreed because younger people had lost the ability to add without a machine. Nobody believed that was the whole reason. Rowan Bell helped establish new animal health protocols and independent feed testing. For the first time, workers could call him without wondering whether asking a veterinary question might cost them a shift. The changes were not perfect. There were arguments. Expenses ran higher than expected. A water line burst during the first hard freeze. Luis discovered that owning problems collectively did not make the problem smaller, but the gate stayed open, and nobody had to lower their voice when talking about the people who ran the place. Walter Keene returned in April. He arrived in an old silver pickup with Montana plates and sat behind the wheel for nearly 5 minutes before getting out. Time away had sharpened him. At 60, Walter was still lean and angular, but his already weathered face had grown more deeply lined. Gray had almost completely overtaken the brown in his unruly hair. A short, uneven gray beard covered his narrow jaw, and his pale blue-gray eyes retained the guarded look of a man who had learned how quickly familiarity could become exclusion. He wore a faded red-brown flannel shirt under an old olive canvas jacket, washed jeans and boots carrying road dust from several states. Eli met him near the cooperative gate. Walter looked at the new sign. "So that's real." "Mostly." Walter snorted. "That's reassuring." He did not return looking for a job. He did not want an apology from Alderwick. He only wanted to see what had happened to the place he once believed he had to flee. Luis came from the barn. Edith followed. For a second Walter looked as if he might leave. Then Margaret appeared carrying a pie. Walter stared at it. "You still bribing people with blueberries?" Margaret answered, "Only difficult men." "Then you should have brought 2. The old tension broke. Not completely. Healing rarely worked that neatly. But Walter stayed for coffee. That was enough. Re-hook. Near the end of the afternoon, Walter walked alone toward the cooperative gate. Rook followed him. Walter noticed after several steps. "You checking whether I steal something?" Rook kept walking. Walter stopped beside the fence. Beyond it, workers moved cattle between pens under a bright spring sky. For years, Walter had remembered this place through one final image, himself driving away while no one came after him. Now Rook sat beside his boot. Walter looked down. "I suppose you're the one everybody talks about." Rook lifted his face. Walter's hand hovered above the shepherd's head but did not touch him immediately. Then, slowly, he rested his palm between Rook's ears. His expression tightened. "I wasn't wrong," Walter whispered. Eli heard him from several yards away. Walter swallowed. "I just thought being alone meant I must be." No one answered. There was nothing to correct. Rook simply stayed beside him until Walter was ready to walk back. Sometimes vindication did not feel like victory. Sometimes it only meant learning that the loneliness had lied. Margaret never returned to work at the farm. Instead, she rented a narrow storefront beside Alderwick's weekend market. The space had once been a florist shop and still smelled faintly of old wood and dried lavender. Eli helped renovate it during the final weeks of his leave. They installed a commercial oven. He repaired shelves. Margaret argued that the long wooden table he built was too large. Then she invited enough people to prove him right. Wildflowers appeared in glass jars along the windows. Blueberry pies cooled beside cinnamon bread. Coffee seemed to be brewing at every hour. Margaret named the place the Open Table. There was one rule: anyone could sit. No one had to buy something first. Children came after school. Farm workers stopped for breakfast. Widows sat beside young parents. Walter occupied the same corner every Saturday whenever he was in Minnesota. Margaret never reopened the bakery she once imagined having. The Open Table was not really a bakery. It was a place built around a belief she had learned too late and intended to practice for the rest of her life. Nobody should have to earn the right to belong at the table. On Eli's final morning before returning to his unit, he walked with Margaret along Alder Lake. Spring sunlight glittered on the water. Birch leaves had returned in bright green, and small purple flowers grew between stones along the shore. Rook ran ahead. A flock of Canada geese grazed near the reeds. The shepherd lowered his body. Eli saw the intention immediately. "Don't." Rook ignored him. Margaret smiled. "He's thinking." "He's never thinking when geese are involved." Rook crept closer. One enormous goose raised its head, then charged. Rook abandoned the mission with astonishing professionalism and sprinted back toward Eli. Margaret burst out laughing. "That's your special operations partner?" Rook stopped several yards away and pretended to inspect a tree. Eli folded his arms. He's courageous under very specific conditions." Margaret laughed harder. Eli found himself memorizing the sound. They continued along the shore. Eventually, Margaret said, "You don't have to protect me forever." Eli looked at her. Her silver-streaked hair moved gently in the lake breeze. There were still lines around her eyes, still memories she would carry. Healing had not returned her to the woman she had been before everything happened. It had created someone else, someone who knew what she could survive. "I know how to stand on my own again," Margaret said. Eli nodded. "I know." That was all. No promise never to leave. No promise nothing bad would happen again. Love was not the ability to guarantee safety. Sometimes it was trusting someone with their own strength. Later, Eli loaded his bag into the pickup. Rook jumped into the passenger seat. Across the valley, vehicles belonging to several different farmers moved through the cooperative gate. No single name ruled the entrance anymore. At the open table, Margaret stood beneath the wooden sign. June was carrying coffee. Luis had somehow acquired flour across the front of his jacket. Edith appeared to be explaining something to three children who were clearly not listening. Eli watched them. Then he remembered his first day back. Rook stopping. Margaret standing where she did not seem to belong, a hand hidden beneath a sleeve. At the time, Eli thought the dog had found someone who needed rescuing. Now he understood it differently. Rook had simply been the first living thing in a long while willing to stop long enough to notice that Margaret was afraid. Dogs did not understand contracts. They did not understand payroll systems, court hearings, or regulatory authority. Perhaps they did not understand destiny either, but they understood trembling hands, changed breathing, a smile that did not match the heartbeat beneath it, and sometimes one creature refusing to walk past another creature's fear was enough to make a human stop too. Then another, and another, until silence was no longer the price of belonging. Eli started the engine. Rook looked once toward Margaret, then forward. Alderwick had not become perfect. It had simply become a place where people could speak without first checking who was listening. For Eli, that was enough. Rook had not brought him home so he could save his mother. Rook had brought him home so Margaret, and eventually an entire town, could remember they had never been as powerless as fear had taught them to believe. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright signs, or answers that come all at once. Sometimes God works through something much quieter. A loyal dog that refuses to keep walking. A son who finally notices the fear his mother has been hiding. A frightened worker who decides to speak. A neighbor who discovers that the burden they thought they carried alone is being carried by others too. Eli came home believing that strength meant protecting the people he loved. But through Margaret, Rook, and the people of Alderwick, he learned something deeper. Real strength is not always standing in front of someone. Sometimes it is standing beside them while they find the courage to stand for themselves. Margaret had spent too long believing silence was the price of survival. The workers at Silver Crown believed fear was something each of them had to carry privately. Walter believed being alone meant he must have been wrong. Even Nolan discovered that gratitude to someone who once helped him could never excuse the harm he later helped create. But truth began to change everything the moment one person stopped looking away. And perhaps that is one of the ways God works in ordinary life. He may not remove every hardship before it reaches our door. He may not always explain why good people suffer, why fear lasts so long, or why justice can take so much time. But sometimes He places someone beside us at exactly the moment we are losing the strength to continue. Sometimes that person is family. Sometimes it is a stranger. Sometimes it is an entire community. And sometimes, as Eli discovered, it may even be a faithful dog with enough instinct to notice the pain human beings have learned to hide. There may be someone in your life right now who is smiling while carrying something heavy. Someone may be afraid to ask for help because they do not want to become a burden. Someone may believe nobody would understand. We may never know every silent battle happening around us, but we can choose to notice. We can listen without judging. We can sit beside someone without demanding an explanation. We can offer a meal, make a phone call, speak up when something is wrong, or simply remind another person that they do not have to face everything alone. Small acts of kindness rarely look like miracles when they happen. but to the person who desperately needed one, they may become exactly that. If this story reminded you of someone who once stood beside you when you needed it most, share it with someone you care about. And in the comments, tell us what this story meant to you, or share a moment when a person, an animal, or an unexpected act of kindness changed the direction of your life. If you believe stories about loyalty, courage, faith, healing, and second chances still deserve to be told, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey. May God bless you and your family. May He give strength to those who are tired, courage to those who are afraid, comfort to those carrying pain in silence, and wisdom to all of us to recognize when someone beside us needs kindness. May He protect your home, guide your steps, and place good people along your path when the road becomes difficult. And may we never become so busy with our own journey that we fail to stop when another soul needs us. Because sometimes the miracle is not that God removes the storm. Sometimes the miracle is that He sends someone to stand beside us until we remember we are strong enough to walk through it.